your genome is not a blueprint. It's never going to tell you what you're going to be, what you're going to do.
There's this question of whether or not we're going to be like Icarus ourselves and we're going to blow ourselves up with technology, whether it's genes, AI.
I think it's entirely possible. Every time there's a major advance, we seem to just almost reflexively say, oh, now we understand. We were so ignorant back then. Now we finally understand how genes do these things. I think that Watson was one of the people who helped create that culture. How did he turn into the world leader of science in the late 20th century, and then the most notorious racist pariah in the history of the science of the 21st century? How did that happen?
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Dr. Nathaniel Comfort, professor of the history of medicine at Johns Hopkins University and biographer to James Watson, co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA. Your colleague Matthew Cobb and I had a discussion last year, and attitudes about genetics and the future of how genetics are going to play into the lives of people, things like embryo selection, came up in that discussion. And it was apparent that we have very different attitudes in the US versus other places. You've done a presentation with the National Institutes of Health about our future in this domain. Has your attitude changed? What do you think about these issues?
My thinking has evolved, of course, but I've spent many years thinking about the social and cultural impacts of genetic determinism. And I find, if anything, I'm more strongly opposed to it, I think, than I was then. I think it's something that we have been very much acculturated to. And it becomes part of the standard working lexicon for anybody who kind of keeps up with the news and science in even a general consumer way. And it becomes almost second nature. You're just almost, or not second nature, but like a reflex. My genes made me do it. My current book, a biography of James Watson, which we'll talk about later, it very much speaks to that, because I think that Watson was one of the people who helped create that culture of belief in DNA or the gene as the secret of life.
How do you think he did that? Let's get into in a little bit of James Watson, because maybe first to start, how long did you know James Watson, so that people have that sense of scale?
Well, I first met him in 1991.
Yeah.
When I was hired as the science writer at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. I was a refugee from neurobiology at grad school, and I wanted to write about science, and I got this job and really enjoyed it. I worked at Cold Spring Harbor for 4 years. Watson was my boss's boss, right? So I had a fair amount of interactions, and I saw him both in professional and social situations. And then I went back for my PhD in history, substantially motivated by my time at Cold Spring Harbor. I wanted to go back and get the credential, and did that. And I stayed in touch with him. We were lost touch for a while, and then we were back in closer touch in the teens, 14 through 2020 and or so. And so I was able to witness some of the let's say awkward moments that he was involved with regarding public comments about genes, race, IQ, intelligence, and things like that. So I've known him for, I knew him for 30 years. I wasn't terribly close to him, but we were acquaintances, and I kept up with him.
Mm-hmm. So you've known him that long. I mean, this is James Watson, of Watson and Crick fame. And earlier you were saying that he maybe influenced American attitudes about genetic determinism, things like that. So how did he shape that influence?
Yes. Watson was Mr. DNA, right? He was the face of DNA and the double helix. Watson, Crick, and Morris Wilkins won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1962. And interestingly, between 1953 and 1962, or even 63, 64, 65, Watson wasn't working on DNA. He left DNA behind. So did Crick, to a large extent. And he worked on RNA and protein synthesis. And after the Nobel Prize, beginning in the 1960s, he was rising in science, becoming a real leading figure in the new field of molecular biology. And he wrote his famous book, The Double Helix, in 1968, was published. And from then on, he was associated with DNA and the double helix. And he became the impresario of DNA. And as he rose through the ranks and becoming one of the leading scientists in the country, one of the most influential scientists in the country, and eventually became the first head of the Human Genome Project, the NIH side of the Genome Project. And those all gave him opportunities to tout this idea of DNA as the secret of life. And I think he really did believe that. And so he did, we could talk for hours about all of the various kinds of things that he did, but scientifically, in terms of science policy, in terms of cultural perceptions, giving public talks and lectures and things, he was constantly spreading the word about DNA and why it was going to tell us who we really were.
Hmm. Now, we have this nature versus nurture debate. It seems that a lot of people see it as a 50-50 kind of split. What specifically was he doing that might skew things towards genes?
Well, like any informed scientist, he understood that environment plays a role in our traits, but he was and this is sort of the essence of genetic determinism or hereditarianism, which is to discount the environment and say, yeah, but the really important stuff, what the real essence of who you are is in your DNA, and your environment just shapes what your genes do, right? So the genetic determinist says, yes, it's nature and nurture, but all the important stuff is nature, right? And the nurture part is first of all hard and to understand, and second of all, not as important.
Yeah. How was James Watson getting that message out? I could understand that he believes it. What is he doing that's actually influencing people?
Well, he is leading. He's writing grants. He's hiring scientists. He's writing essays. He's giving public lectures. He has he had a way with words. He was really good at little quips, and always had been. And so he was highly quotable. So he would make it into the headlines, in the newspapers and science journals. And he just became increasingly visible through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as, both in a scientific context and in a public context. He gave a lot of popular lectures. He wrote books and wrote essays that he had published in major media outlets and things. So, he really became the spokesman for DNA.
Yeah. Does one come to mind, an example of one of those quips or something that was particularly catchy?
He said, "We used to think our fate was in the stars. Now we know it's in our genes."
Mm,
Okay.
yeah.
Uh, which is an immediate pull quote, right?
Yeah.
You can't resist it. If you're editing that you're going to put that in big blue block type,
Yeah.
and it has a funny, resonance because it's really making a kind of an implicit analogy between genetic determinism and astrology, which might be more accurate than he meant it.
Yeah. And what was it like for you to be around this guy? I mean, when you, especially when you were, first meeting him, and he's already a giant in the field.
When I first met him, I'm not going to lie, I was pretty terrified.
Hmm.
He was an imposing guy. I'm pretty tall. He's also tall. Um, and, and he just, had these really intense eyes and would just like drill you with them. And he was very intense and he was constantly filtering out all of the noise of the world to get what he thought to get out what he thought was the interesting thing at this moment. So you say stuff and he just disregards it, no, 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 this is what I'm talking about. Right.
Mm.
And so he drives the conversation. I'm speaking of him in the present tense, and I should be using the past tense, which is a difficult shift to make. But that's what it was like, and I gradually learned that, first of all, that he wasn't as scary as he seemed. Uh, Second of all, that there was actually a really gentle and quiet and almost shy side to him that he didn't show in public, but everyone who knew him well knew of and saw and liked. And those who called him their friend were talking about that Jim.
Mm.
Uh, so yeah, so at first it was very intimidating, and he shot me down. He would read everything I wrote that of any significance for the lab. He wanted to read and vet. He didn't. Um, and he was actually a good editor and used a light hand. He was not difficult, but it was, if it wasn't right, he would just say, no, that's not right. Go do it again. This is
Mm.
what I want.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's a very powerful character who's used to being in control of the situation.
Yeah. So to put this picture together, there's this man who he was 25 years old when they discovered the double helix.
25 when it was published,
When it was
24
published.
when they found it. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's had this lifelong career as this incredibly prominent scientist, Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah.
He's physically intimidating. He's great with words. And then he has this sort of prickly character as well
Yes.
that puts people a little bit on edge. Um,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
stack all that together, and now you can see I think the picture of influence that's coming from this guy. Now, I wonder,
Yeah.
is there that much counter argument to the power of genes?
Oh, yes. Yes. Um, Very, very much so. And increasingly in the last 10 or 20 years, people still tend to think of nature and nurture as a zero sum thing. And so that leads to questions like, well, what percentage of this trait is due to nature and what percent is due to nurture? And we now understand that that's a great oversimplification. For any given trait that you're thinking about, yes, genes and environment are going to influence it, but in ways that are very context dependent. Um, the way my genes contribute to my uh, to one kind of intelligence in a certain kind of situation might be very different. The environmental influences might be greater or lesser or very different in a different setting, in a different context. And so one of the first things we need to do to dismantle this rigid nature-nurture dichotomy is to understand that the concept of heritability, which is something that gets thrown around a lot by people like the author Charles Murray, one of the authors of the Bell Curve book, things like that. In these debates over things like race and IQ, they talk about heritability, and they're constantly making an elementary error, which is that heritability is the proportion of a given trait that can be ascribed to genes, but it's context dependent. It's not independent of the situation. You can't say what the human heritability of intelligence writ large is, because the heritability of intelligence in humans changes depending on the context.
So then the way to test that out would be adoption studies?
No, honestly, I don't think it's even worth. I don't think there's a real scientific question there. If you want to ask about the innate intelligence of different groups of people, particularly if you're thinking about human races, it's just not a scientific question. There's no real meaning. We don't agree on what intelligence is. Race is a social construct, and scientifically, the genes have a big impact on complex traits like intelligence or personality or so forth, but it's diffuse. It's it's spread out over hundreds, if not thousands of genes, right? It may only account for a few percent of the variation in that trait, and it's going to be due to thousands of genes that are making all kinds of proteins that are involved in making the cells that you're using to think with. So yes, genetics is important because, without the genes, you wouldn't have built the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
But something like intelligence is not a fixed static quantity that you can, go and find the 3 magic genes for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It just doesn't work that way.
Right.
The way we interact with the world is a mix of our, mental qualities, physical qualities we were born with, things that we've learned and become trained to over the course of our life, and the specific experience in which you're considering the question, right? So I really think we need to just dismantle and discard the nature versus nurture, even the nature and nurture. It's, the people try to finesse it by saying nature via nurture or something like that. And I just don't think that's a helpful way to understand the biology of complex traits, including intelligence.
Yeah. So Nathaniel, how about we drop the intelligence and race element, which is the third rail in this field anyway.
Okay. It's hard not to go there, and especially if you're thinking about Watson. But sure, let's drop that.
We can let that one go.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so.
In the topic of personality, I've had Dr. Robert Plomin on the show. And I would wonder what you think about his work with these adoption studies, twin studies, and then sorting out tremendous effect sizes that seem to be connected to genes in different personality traits and things like that. But you said, so what are you thinking?
Yes. Well, Professor Plomin is something of a nemesis for me on this set of issues. I take a dramatically different position from him. He titled his biggest book Blueprint. Okay, that right there is symbolic of what I disagree with. Your genome is not a blueprint. It's never going to tell you what you're going to be, what you're going to do, and it doesn't. It simply doesn't work that way. The complex traits, personality, and things like that are emerge through the interactions of genes and environmental factors constantly in a dynamic, evolving way. So I just think it's misguided to try to parse out the specific genetic pieces of something as complex as intelligence. You can get statistically significant results, and he may have effect sizes that are statistically, highly significant. But I remember taking biostatistics in college, and my professor said to us over and over throughout the term, statistical significance does not equal biological significance. Okay? So you can get statistically meaningful correlations, but it doesn't tell you anything about the underlying biology. And Plomin seems convinced that it does.
So we're about to get really nerdy. So we're talking about statistical significance, but you could have a statistical significance on a huge sample for a relatively small effect. I believe that he would argue that he finds tremendous effect sizes, that a lot of the difference between people, based on his research, can be attributed to their genes.
Yes, but he still makes the same spurious jump. He does not say that he's got no mechanisms. These are all correlations. And what he's using is techniques like genome-wide association studies, right? Where you take, you get access to a database of people's genomes, right? People who signed up for 23andMe and spit in a tube and sent it off to them and got, and a few weeks later got a report on their ancestry or their health or whatever, right? And you can get significant, and then what these studies do is then look at the information that you provide with it when you fill in the blank, your profile information and so on, where you list whatever diseases or traits or whatever that you want. And scientists then, by access to those databases and that information, and then they scan these huge databases that may contain millions of human genomes, looking for correlations with with traits of interest, and the traits are, as we've been talking about, intelligence, wealth, education, sexuality, all the violent propensity to violence, all the usual things, same things that Francis Galton was interested in the 19th century. But now you get a polygenic index that is a correlation of specific A's, C's, G's, and T's in the genome that cluster together and correlate with the trait that you say is of interest. And you get the significance by the more genomes you look at, the more sensitive that test becomes. So it becomes predictive of the behavior. Sure, on a population level, you can predict, but it gives no mechanism, right? And you get the significance up by looking at more and more millions of genomes, and so the p-values are very robust, and they stand up even when the actual genetic contribution is maybe only 3 or 4%, right? According to standard measures of heritability.
So you said that there's no mechanism. You said that a couple times. So that
Yeah.
let's drill down on what that is, because if in this idea of a blueprint, the mechanism to make my personality is my genes, and then a little bit of my environment, and it all kind of comes together. I mean, what's this no mechanism idea?
Well, your genes themselves don't do anything,
Okay.
right? Um, your genome is what we talk about mostly when we talk about genes is genes that encode roughly speaking, the instructions for making a protein. And it's the protein that has the biological function. DNA itself is quite inert chemically. And so they don't, so when I say we don't have a mechanism, we don't know what genes are active. A lot of the effects that they find aren't even in genes, because 90% of your genome is not coding for proteins. This is where the history comes in. We talk about genes as protein coding regions because that's the way people like Watson and the other and his cohort of pioneers in molecular biology, that's how they understood it. That was the path that they used to figure that out, right? But they didn't know that 90% of the genome had does not make proteins, and much of it, some of it may have no function. A lot of it definitely has functions, and the functions are incredibly complex, and they modify the way the genes act. They can, so a gene can make many proteins. It can make parts of proteins. A, a you can have a gene may make many proteins, and a protein may require many genes to make it. So it's a many-to-many relationship between genes and proteins. And the way that the gene is expressed to make those proteins is under constant environmental influence. Genes are turned on or off. You can't have all the genes on all the time in every cell, because then you'd be growing, you know, um, uh, kidneys out of your big toe, and trying to trying to figure out how to breathe with the gills that we still have DNA for. So what subset of genes are active in a given type of cell during a particular kind of experience? That's strongly influenced by the environment through things like epigenetics, which involves that non-coding DNA that I was talking about. So the way that genes express proteins is very nuanced, full of all kinds of regulatory mechanisms. Biology is super complex, right? And it works by it's strong effects like that are buffered through all kinds of environmental things, so that the particular context, if I'm learning a new skill, okay, let's say I'm trying to learn to snowboard, right? I don't know how to snowboard. I can ski, but I can't snowboard. Um, while I'm learning that and trying to practice moves, trying to learn how to make my body go in a different way, I'm asking my brain to increase the production of certain kinds of proteins. right? That's learning has to involve that somehow. You have to be creating new structures, upregulating, making new connections between your nerve cells and between your nerves and your muscles. So all kinds of biological changes have to occur for me to learn that skill, right? And when I say they don't have a mechanism for something like intelligence, they have no idea what genes they're talking about, how they might be regulated, what the environmental conditions are that they're involved in, and on and on and on, to the point where the relationship between a gene and the complex trait that you're looking at, there's a relation there, but we haven't got the first idea what the actual causal mechanism is,
Hmm.
because there's so many intermediaries and influencing factors and modulating factors.
Yeah. And you said that some of the question of understanding all this requires understanding the history of this field and how the terminology has evolved. You are a professor of the history of this field. I'm just curious, what got you into that? It's a very particular sort of groove in the field.
Yes, and I have to attribute that to Cold Spring Harbor,
Hmm.
honestly. Uh, as I said, I studied marine biology in college, and I went on to a graduate program to study neurobiology of animal behavior. I'm really interested in animal behavior and always have been. And so that's what I was learning. That's what I was being trained in. And then I went to Cold Spring. I'd had genetics, but it wasn't my major subject. And partly it's Jim Watson himself, right? And the history of the place that he built, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, that sucked me in, got me super interested in heredity, and the history of genetics. And the more I learned, the more interesting it became, not only technically and scientifically, but the larger social issues. And that's the training in history, right? Where I took my biological training and then I I ran my brain through the history factory, right? Where they trained me to think in terms of larger social and cultural influences on events, and think of change over time, and how things could be otherwise, contingency, like the importance of context. And so the questions of about genes and heredity and the role of DNA in making us who we are just becomes so rich when you combine the history and the science, right? That it's been easy to spend 30 years doing it and then look up and say, well, what just happened,
So what has been happening in this field through history, particularly in the U.S.? I mean, what are those moments in history, and as you said, that with the social science element, how they affected social issues?
Okay. So you're asking about the historical events themselves, not the historical writing, not the views of historians.
It
Is
can
that
it can
correct?
be either.
Okay,
And I'm curious how you see it, and so that people can understand the bigger context that we're in, because I think it's
sure.
easy to look at right now and say, wow, we have CRISPR. Like, we have just for the first time come to this point where we can control our genes, and people are starting to believe that and get excited about it. But what I
Yeah,
understand from your work is that in fact, we've had many waves where people have had this kind of enthusiasm, and then those
yeah.
those wax and wane. And so I'd like to understand those waves and to help other people understand those.
Right. Gotcha. Let me just first say, since you mentioned CRISPR, uh, I don't want to be painted as a wild-haired radical who doesn't believe in science. I do think that um, genetics, and including CRISPR, and including um, modified genes, has tremendous potential, and I was already beginning to show it in certain aspects of medicine, particularly cancer. Right? It's very, very useful and powerful. I don't think it's likely to have that same impact on, say, psychology. And this is where Robert Plomin comes after me. But so the moments, the waves, that's absolutely right. Looking over the course of the 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries, I see that every time there's a major advance in either technique or method, new techniques and methods that are introduced, or concepts that were introduced that that is that are really transformative, major advances, there's always a wave of genetic determinism that follows it. So in the mid-19th century, Darwin articulated heredity as a biological problem and differentiated it from embryological development and from the evolution of higher taxa, right? And his half-cousin, Francis Galton, got a hold of that and said, oh, what a fantastic idea. I'll bet we could apply that to people and we could use it to improve the lives of people, right? So we have the first wave of eugenics triggered by Darwinism. At the turn of the 20th century, Mendelism. Gregor Mendel published his famous paper in 1866, but it wasn't until 1900 that it was recast, reframed, understood in a different way, and turned into the foundation of what was quickly called a new science of genetics. Mendelism created, and this is, genetics as recessive and dominant effects, right? And so forth. Created in the wake of that, it was really Mendelism that was a big part that underlay the eugenics movement that was so of the early 20th century, the progressive era in which the U.S. was really the out front as the world leader in eugenics. Not a happy thing to be proud of, but that was another one. Mendelism created a big wave of genetic determinism because it seemed like now we understand. Oh, it's all just dominant recessive. There's a gene for everything. What's the gene for feeble-mindedness, right? And human cytogenetics in the mid-20th century, in the 1950s, when we finally learned how to count human chromosomes correctly and found there were 46 instead of 48. Fun fact, when Watson and Crick found the double helix, we still thought humans had 48 chromosomes per cell. It was only 3 years later that they got the right number. That led to the discovery of chromosome anomalies that, occasionally someone is born with an extra X or Y chromosome or missing an X or Y chromosome. Yeah. Bingo. You have the XYY male, right?
And this is so humbling too. I mean, to think that we discovered the double helix, Watson and Crick discovered the double helix, and we didn't know how many chromosomes there were. I mean, just to see that this field can be pushing and falling behind all at the same time is really illuminating. I just want to emphasize that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really striking when they found the double helix. Human genetics in the Mendelian, the classical sense, was about it where fruit fly geneticists had been in 1915. Okay. In the late 1950s, they were just about up to where the Drosophila geneticists had been in the teens. Right? Quickly caught up thanks to gene mapping and the Genome Project that kind of made the difference insignificant. But yes, the XYY male, the super male, is supposedly an occasional person is born with an extra Y chromosome through a process at embryo during fertilization called non-disjunction of chromosomes. You get an extra copy, and there was thought that someone looked at a prison population for insane criminals, the criminally insane in the UK, and found that a large number of people seemed to have in there of inmates. They had a much larger proportion of XYY males than the general population. That led to a almost 15-year debate over whether having an extra Y chromosome. The idea is that it gives you, you're a super male, right? You have two Y chromosomes, so you must be doubly masculine in every way, including hairy and aggressive and mean and nasty and bad breath and whatever.
And apparently likely to end up in prison.
And apparently likely to end up in prison, insane because you murdered your mother or something. But no, not more likely to end up in prison, not at all. When they actually went back and did the studies, find that there's no correlation at all. It seems intuitive. It makes sense, but it's not. Right? Recombinant DNA in the 1970s, the first generation of genetic engineering. Human cloning in the late 1980s, all the way up through CRISPR. Every time there's a major technical or theoretical breakthrough in our understanding of heredity and development, this also goes for reproductive technologies. Three-person baby, three-parent babies and so forth. Every time there's a major advance in theory or method, there seems to be, we seem to just almost reflexively say, oh, now we understand. We were so ignorant back then. Now we finally understand how genes do these things. Let's go find the genes for intelligence and wealth and sexuality and violence and so forth.
Yeah. So seeing all of these waves now, what can we learn from those to help us better see the current moment?
Well, the way you were struck by that notion, of wow, this is a repeating phenomenon. And first of all, simply being aware that this happens can give you some historical distance, some perspective on our times. You can see that and say, oh, here we go again, right? And that immediately it opens the door to a kind of skepticism and can help us not just accept wrong ideas that intuitively make sense, right?
Yeah.
In the long, so that awareness, I think, helps immediately. Just making people aware that this is a historical pattern. We can even talk about what kinds of social mechanisms might trigger these waves of hereditarianism every time we think we now understand, right? In the long term, what's going to do it is really, we're going to have to just disabuse ourselves of the nature-nurture dichotomy, and just understand that, yes, genes are involved in everything, anything you name, any behavior, any trait. People sometimes think that I don't believe that genes are involved. Of course they are. Everything, right? What I don't believe is that it's going to be scientifically interesting or useful in most cases to look at individual genetic contributions to hugely complex traits. Right? It just doesn't help to think about what part of loneliness is genetic. We should be thinking about social reasons for why people are lonely. Right?
And then with that perspective, then what is to be done?
So works like Professor Plomin's blueprint, and there have been plenty others. I don't want to single him out uniquely. What's dangerous about that is that genetic determinism tends to support the status quo. Okay. It tends to reinforce the existing boundaries of class and race and sex and gender and you name it, ability that are the status quo today. If you say poor people are poor because they're stupid and they're stupid because they don't have good genes, then there's nothing you can do about it, right? The poor people are just gonna be poor. So the danger of genetic determinism, the real social risk, is that it makes us complacent and it makes us accept the status quo, and it tends to lower the incentive to make the social changes that we know work.
Okay. So let's tie this together. So if there are studies, evidence that socioeconomic status is heritable, which we have, then we can say, well, it's in your genes that you're going to be poor, that you're going to have low socioeconomic status, and therefore the need to do something in other structures of life to affect someone's socioeconomic status can be disregarded because we can just write it off as in your genes.
Yeah, that's basically right. I mean, of course, there are lots and lots of ways to nuance that and make it more precise. But as a general picture, yeah, that's right. It tends to reduce our incentive to do that. And so what I'm saying is, yes, genes do influence socioeconomic status. Yes, I'm not denying that. But I think it's a small contribution, and I don't think that the genetics of it is likely to prove very interesting. I think you're going to find that it's the genetics of socioeconomic status are very much like the genetics of all kinds of other big personality traits, because the genetic components are largely sort of structural and static, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we want to change, if we're interested in improving people's SES, what we need to think about is not the part that is whatever it is fixed, but the part that we can change.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. So we
But
can
the
look
one
at it
thing I would
like,
say, if I may, sorry,
please.
just to finish the thought, that is going along with that idea of maintaining the status quo, it also tends to reinforce class structure, that it makes money, right? Technology makes money. Social programs cost money. And so a hereditarian outlook it tends to be, I'm not saying, I'm referring to any one individual person right now, but it reinforces a kind of a corporatist outlook and makes it harder to do the social programs, because those don't make money, they cost money.
Okay. So not only does the more deterministic look reduce incentives to address a social problem, but then it also creates incentives to attack it with businesses, products, services, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
When it comes to intelligence, is education both a product and a social program? It seems that we really do a lot to fund people's education, to move them up through the education system, and yet at the same time, these universities do sell education, particularly college education, for hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of a few years. How do you see education in this?
We need to differentiate between K-12 education and university,
Hmm.
college and postgraduate education. We've, as a nation, substantially abandoned the idea of public education for all our children, which is a crime, and that also serves a particular conservative agenda. But the universities are um, so so. I'm still struggling a little bit. Do you want? What's the genetic part of what you're asking about universities?
Well, at this point, I'm wondering, just when we're talking about programs versus products to address a genetic thing,
Yeah.
if we see educational
Okay.
attainment as something that's heritable,
Okay.
is our university system a product to address it, or a social program, or likely a mix of both? How do
Oh,
you see it?
yeah. Okay. Yes, it would be a mix of both for sure. Um, you know, Universities are nonprofit uh, organizations, but that doesn't mean they don't make money,
Right.
right? And um, so you have and the people studying things like the genetics of educational attainment, which is the currently acceptable substitute for what we used to use IQ for, right? That's years of school completed, which is basically an a currently acceptable way of talking about intelligence and not using the word. But the people who are doing those studies are in universities. They're part of, they are writing grants. They're bringing money into the universities. Yes, absolutely. And they're also genuinely curious, interested people. I know a lot of folks who study social genomics, and almost everyone is, a really decent, that I can think of, who I know is decent, sincere, honest, earnest, believes that what they're doing is, or at least could be, used for good. They're not evil people, right?
Yeah.
um, they don't. When I've worked with them, I found that it's very hard to get them to think historically, to look at the larger patterns in the work that they're doing. They'll be, you get a certain amount of, what honestly amounts to sort of lip service. You get the obligatory paragraph in a genomics paper that gives a nod to the history of eugenics and says we don't want to go that way. But that's not serious engagement with the historical issues. So so they so this so the people who do this work are both in a revenue generating activity on that's generating revenue on several different levels, from personal to the institutional to the corporate. Um, and so if you're asking, is there a possibility that those interests shape the scientific questions they ask about things like the genomics of educational attainment? Yes. Yes,
Sure.
they do. I don't think by itself that corrupts the question altogether. I think the question is corrupt, in the sense of not valid, as I said, scientifically. But um, but yeah, they want to keep. Geneticists want to keep doing genetics, right? That's what you're trained to do, and you want to keep. And so the science, and this is also comes with every technological advance, came with Mendelism as well. Um, that the successful methods are those that generate more experiments,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, um, so so yeah, it is by its nature, by its I should be careful. Um, it's inherently a to some extent a self-interested enterprise, um, but that's just the way the science works. I don't think that in itself is I would not see that as necessarily a corrupting influence, but it does tend to push science toward the kinds of studies that generate more experiments, toward developing methods for getting at stuff, because no one's going to give you grant money to not get at stuff, right? And to
Right.
say, no, it doesn't really work. Genes aren't really all that important. Your funding is going to dry up very quickly,
Yeah.
if you try to do that kind of thing.
Right. So, Nathaniel, seeing your attitudes about these things, what drew you to writing the biography of James Watson when he seems to be the driving force behind a lot of things that you have these qualms about?
Yes. Well, I'm writing I've been thinking about the current book for about 25 years, and I've been actively working on it for about 12. Um, and to some extent, you have to take the problems that life gives you. And I happen to have the experience, the training, and the access
Yeah.
to an approach to the life of, what certainly one of the most significant scientific figures of the 20th century. Um, and so, I can't not do it. Nobody else can write the book that I can. Um, and yes, very much, the troubling aspects of, especially of Watson's later years, are, I have to deal with them as an honest scholar, and I have to try to use his life as a way to understand these issues the way we've been talking about them. The kinds of things that I've been saying about genetics, genetic breakthroughs, reinforcing the status quo, and the dangers of genetic determinism, how they tend to lead to other social problems. A lot of that comes out of thinking about Watson, researching his life,
Mm.
seeing how he developed over time. Where did this gawky, awkward, bright, but strange young man, how did he turn into the the world leader of science in the late 20th century, and then the most notorious racist pariah in the history of the science of the 21st century? How did that happen?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the rise and fall is fascinating. It's tragic. I don't hate Watson. I don't love Watson. I'm trying to do an even-handed, I'm really trying to do an honest, even-handed appraisal that helps us understand the role of genes and why we think we are the way we are.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Because his rhetoric was a lot of what told us, a lot of people believe some version of, it's in my DNA. I can't believe it. Right. So understanding the history of how those ideas were created and developed over time, I think, gives an opportunity for really getting some traction on these hard and vital social ideas.
Yeah. You said the rise and fall, and the working title right now is American Icarus. Is that it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. How'd you pick
That's right.
that?
That was actually suggested by Matthew Cobb.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, yeah. He and I worked. We're very good friends, and we worked very hard together on um, both on an article that we wrote together in Nature, and then as he just published his book, his biography of Francis Crick.
Yes.
Crick, A Mind in Motion, and I want to get in a plug for that because he also plugs me every chance he gets. But we were doing that work in parallel, working on the double helix story together, and trying to understand Rosalind Franklin and what exactly she did and did not do. What did Watson and Crick know, and what did they not know, and so forth. So yeah, he came up with that, and I really like it because it captures that moment of hubris and tragedy,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. For you as a biographer, do you think about structure the way that, say, a storyteller in the more traditional, fictional sense would? Do you think, okay, there's going to be a midpoint, and there's going to be an all is lost moment, and that sort of thing?
I absolutely do.
Yeah. In
Yes.
the Watson story, I mean, how is that playing out for you?
Um, it's kind of roughly. I'm envisioning it now as kind of roughly like a 5 act Shakespearean kind of
Yeah.
play, right? Where you have in his life, his development is or acts 1 and 2, the double helix maybe is act 3. Act 4 is the building of this incredible career, becoming the kid who found the double helix to the world leader of international science. And Act 5 is the is where hubris creates the tragedy and people get hurt and so on. Yeah. But I think about structure on lots of levels. I'm an enormous fan of the writer John McPhee, who's not a novelist, but a creative nonfiction writer, one of the pioneers of that field. I also read fiction. I've always been fascinated by narrative and storytelling, and I like to I like to make arguments through telling stories. Yeah. So I think about structure in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else coming to mind? I can see that you're this multidisciplinary guy. You're the history of medicine. You're writing the biography with the fictional story phrasing. Oh, what else?
Yeah. Well, the third sort of big domain is the arts, right?
Hmm.
Um, and the creative side. I kind of see um, 3 broad domains of ways of knowing about the world. One that we could say is through science, right? Through experimentation, evidence, logic, reason, quantification. Then the human side, which to me, in my mind, is historical, which is looking at not the general trends and the universal laws, but thinking about the particulars, the specific individuals without whom things would have gone differently, how things could have been otherwise. How did the particular context of this event shape the way it happened, right? And those are both two uh, in my mind, highly complementary ways of knowing. And I've spent many years being trained in both of those. The third way of knowing about the world is, to me, it seems like is metaphorically, right? Through understanding something that I don't know through something that I do, right? Or seeing analogies and parallels and making that kind of intuitive leap that is definitely a powerful way of knowing about the world. And, and so I'm constantly, so this book really does, it is my immersion in all three of those domains and trying to bring them together into some kind of coherent statement.
Oh, yeah. And it's interesting, too, because you said that part of Watson's influence was that metaphorical level, was the ability to paint together simple pictures that people could catch on to and go. So for you to illuminate him and the current moment and your concerns, you're also up against this great figure who can do that same thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a really good observation, and those kinds of moments of recursion
Mm-hmm.
uh, are throughout this book. It's
Bet,
just yeah, absolutely,
bet.
absolutely, and I kind of relish those. I've always been a fan of the idea of recursion um, eh, eh, so yeah, I play with that and run with it a bit.
Right, right. Well, and that's what we were talking about earlier too. In this science, we're seeing these waves coming, looking at the current moment through that lens, the science, the people, and then this metaphorical level. There's this question of whether or not we're going to be like Icarus ourselves, and we're going to blow ourselves up with technology. Whether it's genes, AI, whatever. How do you look at this moment through those lenses?
I think it's entirely possible.
Yeah.
um, yeah, the because we never have enough as a population, as a species. We want more knowledge, more money, more power, bigger houses, faster cars, and it's got to come from somewhere, right? And we and we don't like thinking, technology and science are sexy. Everybody wants to go into STEM programs in college and so forth, right? They're killing off the humanities and arts programs everywhere. Um, and that has some pretty serious risks, uh, not least of which is that scientists are good at looking forward, but terrible at looking backward, right? And so we're always chasing the next thing. What do I need to gobble up to get that? Right. And and the long-term planning isn't there. We're as a species, we're terrible at long-term planning, right? We don't see the future. We don't think about the past. And so the the short-term gains might become so attractive that we um that I mean, AI is a good example. It's a very, very powerful and useful set of tools, and there's so much hype about it, and they're going in so hard with so much money and developing so much so fast. Uh, there are likely going to be ecological disasters that are going to come out of this, right? Um, and we're probably not going to see it coming, except for you and me and half a dozen other people who who try to look at the big picture, right? Um, so it, the way to stop it is pretty uh, is pretty idealistic, and that is to be satisfied,
Mhm.
You know, can we be satisfied with not having the fastest rate of growth of everything all the time, right? Even things that we would generally consider social benefits, like medicine. Medicine's very expensive. Medicine covers a lot of genomics research, covers a lot of AI money is going to medicine. Um, it's an enormous, enormous industry, and it consumes a lot of resources. So it's these big information industries, genomics and computing and software. Um, it does scare me.
Mhm.
It does. I'm not going to lie. Yeah, I think there are ways out, but probably if you're not going to be a billionaire and be able to just eject yourself, to some new habitat, you're probably going to have to uh, uh, go live more modestly, I think.
Mm. Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. So we've got the science here that these technologies are very powerful. We've got this people element that there is human nature being what it is, and we want more. Is there a metaphorical element that you see?
Perhaps the metaphorical side could be filled by truth is beauty and beauty truth. The the appeal of knowledge, the appeal of power, the appeal of creating something that appears to think, right? Those are, yes, there are profit motives and there are social motives, but there's also very strong aesthetic motives, right? To those
Hmm.
for whom it's attractive, it's incredibly attractive, right? It just seems like a beautiful idea to understand this, to be able to cure cancer, to create a brain, to whatever, right? I do think there's a kind of a deep level, um, emotional, almost poetic, aesthetic dimension to that, to the drive to for progress all the time. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. What do you think James Watson would have said, or maybe did say? I mean, a lot of things he might have said are sort of drowned out. But what might he have said about AI?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think, um, given his enthusiasm, so I can thinking metaphorically, I can
Yeah.
analogize to the kinds of ways he reacted to genomics, right? Um, and so based on that, he would, and his attitude toward biomedical science all his career, he would have been all for it. It should be, he'd want to see it as much be publicly funded as possible, and we haven't a minute to waste if AI could tell us sooner who's going to die of what when.
Hmm.
So I think he would have a an idealistic, consistent with his views over the course of his life, including the Genome Project. I think I think he would be a very strong advocate, very principled in what he believed it should be used for, and and take it as an absolute given that we must do it as fast as possible.
Yeah. And what else would you expect from the guy that you call American Icarus? He's, let's go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Uh, I think that's all I
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
have on
Yeah.
that.
How have you used this perspective in your own life? I think you started to mention something about, oh, that's what I'm doing.
Striving for more self-sufficiency, more sort of local, acting locally, trying to use, um, purchase food and things locally when I can, and um, as a I don't want to get into trite, you know, uh, 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 green behavior. I don't. That's not what I'm saying at all. But rather um, a kind of modesty and humility. I guess here's a way to put it.
Sure.
The hubris is what made Icarus's wings melt, right? And um, so one of the lessons, one of the many lessons from Watson's life that I take away is a value for humility, which is hard. You can't boast of being humble, right? Because you outdo yourself. So, um, and I think, yeah, I think a value for humility in a broad sense, not just the normal conversational way we use it, but kind of living with a humility about our position in the world and our role in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Nathaniel Comfort, before we get to our last topic, where's the best place for people to follow along with you online?
I'm on Blue Sky at NC Comfort, and I have a website that I need to update. And you can watch for publications. They'll come out. I'll talk about them on Blue Sky. That's probably the best way to see where, when I've got something new coming out. I'll post things about the book. I am posting things about the book. So that, yeah, I would say find me on Blue Sky,
Yeah. All
NC
right.
Comfort.
Great. We'll put links in the description for people to check out. And Nathaniel
Super.
Comfort, my last question is, we've talked a lot about slowing down, being aware of the history and things. What are you excited about going forward in the world of genetics?
I'm into thermodynamics right now.
Okay.
Uh, I am my next book is going to be on the origin of life, and which started as was going to be a kind of a companion book about DNA that was going to I wanted to do with the Watson book, and it's evolved dramatically, and there's been a revolution in our thinking about the origin of life in the last 15 years that's equivalent, I would say, to the molecular revolution of the 1950s for people like Watson. It's or the plate tectonics revolution in the 60s and 70s, right? In geology, a brand new way of thinking about the origin of life. The primordial soup is out the window. Noodles and all. And more people are thinking about the fact that life emerges uh, a- anytime you have the right starting conditions, and the conditions were just right on the early Earth, way before people were even thinking of scientists had thought life had even started, and the idea that of this new view is that life was not a, a, an astounding once in a quadrillion miracle, but rather that given the starting conditions, it was inevitable.
Hmm.
And that it is that life is a way of life is thermodynamically favorable, right? It's thermodynamically downhill. And that's a really hard concept to grasp. This is a whole huge topic. I'm going to try to be concise here. Um, this new ideas about the origin of life say that life is inevitable. And the complexity of life, increasing complexity, is also thermodynamically favorable, if you understand the arguments. And that actually leads us, to other forms. I think I can make the tie from organic evolution to social and cultural evolution. And I think things like capitalism and AI follow the same sets of rules. And that will, and that could lead to some different ways of thinking about solutions to some of these problems.
By adjusting starting conditions?
The starting conditions are already gone, but by thinking about social change energetically, and what conservation really means, right?
Wow.
AI is all about burning carbon,
Yeah.
So, that's a teaser. I hope it's not more confusing than illuminating.
Yeah. Well, Nathaniel Comfort, we will look forward to that one. And thank you so much for being the kind of person who can pull together these things and communicate them to the rest of us, and for taking this interview. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it.